4 years at Caltech. It's a wonderful school. Linus Pauling was the department chairman. He, Nobel Prize winner twice. The man who taught freshman biology was a Nobel laureate, and the men that taught freshman physics had won the Nobel Prize. So you can't get away with much there. The professors know what they're doing.
What year?
Well, that was 1955 when I went to Caltech. Just went straight through for a doctorate. I did a two-part thesis, one in chemistry on the kinetics problem, and then in the geochemistry minor, I worked on the analysis of meteorites. Now, the interesting thing is, recently in digging through my papers, not my papers, but papers the school had, that at that time I was in graduate school, ASU began to get interested in meteorites. The Sputnik had happened at that time. And there was a man here named George Boyd, and a man who I never met because he died before I arrived, named Crowley, who was chairman of chemistry. And up in northern Arizona was a person named Deininger, who had made a large meteorite collection. And he was thinking of retiring. And George Boyd got the idea that maybe ASU, that was trying to become a real university at the time, might enter the space race by getting this meteorite collection. And the note that I found was that, let me put it this way, it was rather strange that the meteorite collection was in the chemistry department, because that's where the interest was. And they found out that there was a graduate student at Caltech in Pasadena interested in meteorites, and they thought they might get him. I didn't know this at the time.
And that was you.
And that was me. However, when I left Caltech, I went east and I taught 2 years at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And then I got a phone call from New York, and a man named Herbert Fales, who was the vice president of International Nickel Company, said he wanted to come see me. Now, Fales was a flyer, and as a flyer he was interested, he'd seen Meteor Crater in Arizona, and he got to know Neininger, so he was a friend of Neininger's. Neininger introduced him to ASU, and they sent him to talk to me about coming here with Fales. The situation at Wesleyan was this, that it's a very nice school, and wealthy students go there, and it had a great history, but they were going through a phase, I would say, of thinking they were Harvard, and they weren't giving many faculty members tenure. So all the assistant professors were nervous. Now, I'd only been there 2 years, but the ones that were there 5 or 6 were beginning to get nervous, and that came down. And really, then when the opportunity to work with meteorites presented itself, I was willing to consider it. I asked to come here and look the place over, which I did, and that was rather funny in itself. But I was met by George Bateman, who's a wonderful person, and they showed me around, and I decided to take the job. I should say, at that time, of course, ASU, and other people remember this, was all cut up with city streets. We didn't have the mall. The city pretty much ended down where the president's, or the old president's house is on College Avenue, but that was a pig pen at the time, and they hadn't built down that far yet. So it was pretty small place. But I had the opportunity to work with and be in charge of, which was one of the larger meteorite collections in the country. And my memory serves me right, it had about 578 meteorites in it. Now, what I mean by that is, if you have a meteorite from Meteor Crater, counts as one. Even if you had 10,000 pieces, that's only one. So it's so we had meteorites from 578 different localities in the world that Neininger had put together. That was 1961. I don't know, I think it was funny. For example, when they took me to dinner, they took me to the bowling alley to dinner. It's just a big change from what people do now in the recruiting. Then when I said I would come, that was when G. Homer Durham arrived as the new president. So they had in the spring, they had a celebration for his inauguration, and among the things they did was they had a symposium on meteorites. And I arranged to get the speakers, and which included Gerald Kuiper from Tucson and a wonderful man named Al Neer from University of Minnesota and others. Now, by that time, ASU had gotten the grant to get the meteorite collection from the NSF, and that's another story in a way, because what it was the Smithsonian wanted this very badly. But one of the NSF people thought it would be good to not let the Smithsonian have a monopoly on the meteorites, that there should be some checks and balances. And Neininger was interested in having it in Arizona. Apparently, the other institution in Arizona had insulted him, and he had no interest in it going to Tucson, and said that it would cost the NSF a lot more money for that to happen. Now, remember, this is 1960 or so, and even then, it cost over $300,000 to get this collection from him, which was a lot of money then. But NSF was willing to put it up. The state of Arizona put in about $50,000, and Mr. Fales, who had come to see me, gave a private donation. And he was a faithful friend even after that. Every year he'd give us money to support us. When he retired from New York, he moved to Phoenix, and he was a graduate of MIT, but always said, well, if I live in Arizona, I should support ASU, which wish we had more people like that these days. Neininger was quite a character. He, in the 1920s, was a biology teacher at McPherson College in Kansas, and a big fireball went over, and he chased the fireball, and he did not find the meteorite from the fireball, which is not unusual, but he found two other meteorites on farms that had fallen at some undetermined time in the past. So when we have meteorites on our collection, some are falls, which actually are seen to fall or hit a roof or something like that, and some are finds that may have fallen 1 million years ago and just been sitting there. I mean, as I mentioned, at Meteor Crater, it's 50,000 years ago that meteorite landed, and you can find meteorites on the surface from that fall. So they haven't rusted away. Some do and some don't. And he realized there were meteorites out there, and he got interested. And he was, what I would say, a real nut. And I think sometimes great advances in science and things are made by nuts. And he quit his job and started chasing meteorites. He wrote very well. He wrote books that he sold. He would get meteorites and trade them. He would offer to give talks to clubs and schools for pay. And then, of course, the Depression came along when you didn't need to make that much money to scratch, and farmers needed a little money. If they found a meteorite, they'd sell it to them at a reasonable amount. And he built this collection up to the 500-plus meteorites that I told you about earlier.
How did he end up in Arizona?
Well, he went from Kansas to the Natural History Museum in Denver. Then, of course, the magnet in Arizona for meteorites is Meteor Crater. And so he went down there and set up a museum on Old Route 66 north of the crater. You can still see the ruins there of this building. Now, it's very interesting, I found recently, from a wonderful museum in Winslow, he didn't build that museum. Someone else had tried it earlier, and it didn't work and went under right after 29. But he came along, and he had his museum up there. When they built the interstate, then people weren't going by on Route 66 anymore. He moved to Sedona and had a museum there. And that's actually where I first saw him. When I was at Caltech, I guess in about 1957, I came over here on a trip to Arizona to see different things. And we went to the Meteorite Museum in Sedona. Little knowing that a few years later, that would be my take over from him to curate the samples and and come to ASU. I think one of my problems is I have too many interests, and even at ASU I'd have been more efficient when I got here, because I was in charge of the meteorite collection, and then that was in chemistry, so I was a professor of chemistry, and I volunteered to be a professor of geology department, and that's a little too thin, if you know what I mean. The strength of the Meteorite Center progressing was really from Homer Durham. He knew that this was important, he knew this was exciting, and you know, it's the same thing. When you have the president of the university really interested, he can put pressure on the dean and the chairs for space and things like that. It's kind of analogous, to me at least, because I enjoy very much being a classroom teacher. If you have a few peppy students in the front row, that pulls the professor along too, and the same thing with Durham's interest and concern. Just before he left, I guess one of the most exciting things happened in my career at ASU, which many people remember me for, was then I applied to do the analysis of the moon rocks when they were brought back, and then he left at the same time, which was very disappointing to me, but